Imagine you are a mother living in a remote, dust-swept village in Pakistan. Every single day is a calculated battle for baseline survival. You look at your children, you calculate the soaring cost of flour, milk, and electricity, and you realize that your entire household budget is completely collapsing under the weight of runaway inflation. Then, a small lifeline arrives. The state hands you a cash stipend through a federal social safety net. It is just enough to keep your family from absolute starvation, just enough to buy a few bags of food. For a moment, you breathe a sigh of relief. But as the weeks turn into months and months turn into years, you notice something deeply unsettling. You are not getting any poorer, but you're absolutely not getting any richer either. You are completely trapped in a state of permanent survival, sitting on a safety net that was supposed to lift you up, but is instead just keeping you suspended barely inches above total destitution. This brings us directly to one of the most critical, uncomfortable questions facing the nation today. Why is the Benazir Income Support Programme failing to end poverty in Pakistan? It sounds like a simple administrative problem, does it not? It sounds like a question of funding or spreadsheets or bureaucratic delays. But the reality unfolding across the country is far more profound. We are currently witnessing a massive structural gridlock where a multi-billion rupee program is successfully keeping millions of people alive, yet completely failing to set them free. But we will get to the specific registration hurdles, the devastating impact of inflation, and the hidden data gaps that leave families stranded during the national disaster in just a moment. First, to understand why the local system is breaking down, we have to understand the actual universal rules of how poverty is defeated on a global scale. See, if you look at the economics of human development, lifting a population out of destitution generally requires two perfectly synchronized engines. The first engine is broad economic growth, which is designed to create widespread employment opportunities, boost industrial productivity, and also naturally raise the overall living standards of a country. The second engine is targeted social protection, which operate as a precise safety net to catch and support the vulnerable population who, for a variety of reasons like health, age, or systematic exclusion, simply cannot participate in the active labor market. Now, here's the golden rule that the most successful global models completely live by. They design their social protection systems with a clear transition in mind, moving population systematically from a reliance on temporary state aid, which we call relief, to a state of permanent self-sufficiency, which experts call graduation. The goal of a true safety net is not to become a permanent home. It is to act as a temporary trampoline that bounces you back into the productive economy. But before we deep dive into why Pakistan's trampoline is feeling more like a quicksand, let's look across the border of a country that completely rewrote the historical script on global development. Let's look at how this exact process helped China. China's historic eradication of absolute poverty, which officially peaked around 2020, resulted in lifting nearly 800 million human beings out of total destitution over the course of just 4 decades. It stands as the single largest, most successful poverty reduction campaign in modern human history. But did they achieve this miracle by simply writing endless welfare checks to rural communities? Not even close. Their success relied on shifting entirely away from broad, generic economic policies straight toward highly granular, data-driven interventions. The entire Chinese foundation began in the late 1970s with the radical policy shift known as household responsibility system. The state boldly decided to decollectivize agriculture, allowing local farmers to legally lease land and, more importantly, giving them the right to sell their surplus crops on the open market after meeting state quotas. This simple injection of market incentives rapidly boosted agricultural productivity across the country, diversified household incomes, and dramatically raised rural living standard almost overnight. But the real catalyst came later. Under the administration of President Xi Jinping, through a highly calculated strategy known as precision poverty alleviation, the Chinese leadership realized that regional, one-size-fits-all approaches were incredibly wasteful and fundamentally ineffective. So, what did they do? The state deployed deep, granular data tracking to identify the exact underlying causes of poverty for individual, specific households. They did not just look at a poor village. They walked into individual homes and asked why this specific family was struggling. If the data showed a household was poor because they were isolated on an inhospitable mountain, the state customized the relief by physically relocating the entire family to a developed valley. If a household was struggling because they lacked capital, the state provided tailored microloans for a specific local business. If a family was destitute due to the chronic illness, the state stepped in to fully cover catastrophic medical treatments. And they paired this precision tracking with the massive belief that physical infrastructure is a direct prerequisite for poverty alleviation. By paving high-quality roads, extending the national electrical grid, and ensuring high-speed internet access reached the most remote, isolated villages, they seamlessly integrated forgotten rural communities straight into the national economy. Suddenly, local farmers were no longer at the mercy of exploitative middlemen. They were selling their goods directly to the wealthy urban centers via modern e-commerce networks. Now, let's flip the script and look at how Pakistan attempted to build its own protective shield. The state's primary, most critical mechanism for poverty alleviation is the Benazir Income Support Programme, which is commonly referred as BISP. Entirely financed by the federal budget, BISP serves as the nation's frontline social safety net. It provides unconditional and conditional cash transfers, such as targeted health and education stipends, primary to low-income female-headed households across the country. To actually identify who deserves this money, Pakistan relies entirely on a centralized database known as National Socio-Economic Registry, or NSER. Originally established back in 2010 and continuously updated to cover roughly 40 million families. The NSER operates as the absolute foundational database for social governance in Pakistan. It is the core tool utilized not just for distributing BISP cash, but for executing federal disaster relief and launching provincial healthcare initiatives during the moment of acute stress. But despite the grand design and the billion of rupees of funneled through the system, the harsh reality is that BISP is falling short for its ultimate promise. While the program has been undeniably successful at preventing millions of vulnerable human beings from sliding into absolute starvation and has clearly improved the basic household food consumption, it operates almost entirely as a bare survival mechanism rather than a real pathway out of poverty. Recent independent economic analysis and extensive World Bank assessments of the NSER database have exposed several deep systematic failures that are crippling the program's long-term impact. The first massive structural bottleneck is what experts call the registration barrier. Back in 2021, BISP had a major administrative shift, moving away from traditional door-to-door sweeping service and instead of relying on static district-level dynamic registration centers. On paper, it sounded like a modern, streamlined upgrade. But in reality, this shift created immense, insurmountable logistical hurdles for the poorest segments of society. Think about the physical reality of a destitute household living in a highly remote rural area. To register at a centralized district center, they have to travel long distances. They often simply cannot afford the steep transportation costs. They cannot afford to lose a full day of vital daily wages. And they cannot handle the grueling wait time required to navigate the bureaucratic process. Consequently, a devastating data gap has emerged, leaving nearly half of all unregistered, perfectly eligible households entirely unaware of how to even enroll in the system. The very people who need the safety net the most are the ones completely cut off from reaching it. And for the families who do manage to successfully register, they face a second, equally ruthless adversary, the erosion of their money by rampant inflation. Pakistan's severe macroeconomic volatility and historically high inflation rates over recent years have delivered a crushing blow to the program. The real purchasing power of BISP cash stipends have been completely melted away. Because the transfer amounts are largely fixed, they completely fail to keep pace with the soaring daily cost of basic foodstuff and electricity tariffs. The money arrives, but it buys less and less every single month, effectively locking the beneficiaries into a permanent state of bare, desperate subsistence. But perhaps the most profound failure of the entire strategy is complete absence of scalable graduation model. BISP excels at providing immediate, short-term relief, but it completely lacks a robust structured mechanism for genuine economic mobility. This is minimal to no structural integration between the cash transfers and vital skills training, productive asset transfers, or localized microfinance initiatives. Because the program fails to build the long-term economic capabilities of these families, there is no off-ramp. Households remain permanently dependent on the state with no clear, realistic pathway to ever generate their own sustained income and eventually exit the program. To make matters worse, the system suffers from a dangerous data lag during the moments of acute national crisis. While the NSER is a powerful database, its strategic architecture severely struggles to account for sudden, localized economic and environmental shocks. Think about a historic, catastrophic event like 22 floods or rapid climate emergencies hitting rural sectors. Within hours, a self-sufficient farming family can lose their home, their crops and their livestock, sliding instantly into absolute poverty. Yet, because the system updates slowly, these newly vulnerable households face long, painful administrative delays before their new status is accurately reflected in the registry to trigger emergency aid. So, how do we fix it? How do we transform Pakistan's social safety net from a perpetual relief fund into a true dynamic engine of economic mobility? To save this strategy, the state must aggressively execute severe radical structural shifts. First, the government must immediately hybridize its targeting mechanism. Relying solely on static registration centers is actively excluding the most marginalized populations. Pakistan needs to aggressively expand the deployment of mobile registration vans, similar to the pilots currently being tested in remote areas of Balochistan, and systematically reintroduce a targeted door-to-door service in highly isolated districts to permanently close the exclusion gap. Second, the program must implement an asset-based graduation model to transition capable beneficiaries toward permanent self-reliance. This involves a highly calculated strategy of pairing the standard cash stipend with the direct transfer of productive assets such as livestock, sewing machines, or a raw business inventory, alongside mandatory financial literacy training and direct localized market access. This approach directly mimics the individualized household capability building that allowed China to clear its slums and rural desolation. Third, the NSER must become a fully dynamic digitalized network. By securely and automatically cross-referring NSER data with the National Database and Registration Authority, known as NADRA, alongside real-time telecom usage data, the government could instantly identify these sudden vulnerabilities. They could effortlessly disperse emergency funds to households hit by sudden climate shocks or economic crises in real time, without ever waiting for manual bureaucratic updates. And finally, the state must take a direct cue from the Chinese playbook and systematically pair cash transfers with aggressive rural infrastructure development. A cash transfer yields an exponentially higher economic return when the receiving community has functional roads to safely transport their goods to the markets, stable electricity to power small local enterprises, and clean water to prevent catastrophic, out-of-pocket health expenses that instantly drag families right back into debt. The story of poverty alleviation is a story of choosing between perpetual management and an actual permanent cure. BISP has proven itself to be a powerful, noble model of state-led social solidarity, keeping millions of citizens from the absolute brink of starvation. But a safety net should never become a permanent ceiling. As the global sandbox fractures and economic pressure mount, continuing forward with a passive relief model is simply no longer sustainable. Pakistan's ultimate challenge is to evolve its safety net into a launchpad combining data precision, structural graduation, and infrastructure development to give every single citizen the capability to write their own script of self-sufficiency. The tools are ready, the failures have been exposed, and the future of the nation's economic security hangs entirely on the courage to execute true reform.